Hello everyone, we're back again with a lecture on the 1950s. This is lecture number 21. The new so-called atomic age will be one of unprecedented affluence for many Americans. While in 1940 the nation had still been mired in an economic depression, a decade later the GNP had grown to 5 times that of Great Britain and 10 times that of Japan. In fact, in the United States, the profit of individual corporations such as General Motors during the 1950s sometimes surpassed the GNP of small nations during this era. So we need to understand the drivers of America's booming economy during the 1950s. Military spending was one of the key drivers of the economy. The federal government began awarding supply contracts to many corporations to keep up with a burgeoning arms race with the Soviet Union. Think about this being the atomic age. They both have the same weaponry. Now it's about stockpiling more nukes than your enemy. Now it's about creating espionage gear, outfitting the CIA to conduct covert operations around the globe. For example, by 1955, military expenditures made up 10% of the nation's gross national product. And one feature of modern-day life that we take for granted was constructed with federal funds during the 1950s for defense purposes, that being the Interstate Highway system, so that in the event that one coast was attacked, the United States could mobilize its forces and get them quickly on the ground to the other coast for defense. The other major factor in the economy really skyrocketing during the 1950s was pent-up consumer demand. So consumer spending is also bolstering the U.S.'s economy. Coming off of years of deprivation, first the Great Depression and the joblessness associated with that, and then Americans having to endure World War II with the rationing of many staple goods, everyone is in the mood to spend by the time we get to the 1950s. And it's no accident that automobiles are in incredibly high demand since there was no new automobile production during the war. You can see from the graph that I have here on the slide, that bottoms out. No passenger vehicles are produced. Instead, Ford, GM, they're all producing military vehicles for the duration of the conflict. And now that people can buy cars, they're taking to the open roads. What started out for defense purposes will quickly find a spot in consumer behavior. In other words, regular civilian life. People like these new interstates, being able to get on a road and not having to stop every 5 minutes at a stoplight, means that they can now travel to see family members. They can organize pleasure trips. This is the beginning of family fights in the back seat during the family road trip vacations. This is truly the era where Americans fall in love with their cars. Everything now seems to be tailored to the needs of households that now own automobiles. For those that don't, we have a rental car industry developing. We have motels being built for people now that are staying overnight away from home. They have to have a place to stay. Fast food restaurants will now develop in the country. Things like drive-through windows, which had never existed prior, are easily taken up by a number of food purveyors throughout the country. People even attended outdoor movie screenings. So, for example, we see drive-in movie theaters become popular across the country. As Americans embrace the automobile in ever larger numbers, it also will affect not just their leisure time, but their fundamental lifestyle choices too. It begins to dramatically reshape where people live and where they work. And here's where we will return to a concept that I introduced to you in a prior lecture, suburbanization. As more and more American households can afford to have an automobile, their own personal form of transportation, this means that for wealthier Americans, middle-class Americans, some of them are making the decision to move outside of urban areas, and you'll start to see the growth of suburban communities on the periphery of many large cities. So widespread car ownership is driving this, no pun intended, but so too will the availability of low-interest government-backed loans to American families to purchase homes. For instance, the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, which was established during the New Deal, typically required that prospective home buyers need only put down 5% of the purchase price of a home before the family could then move in and begin making mortgage payments. Millions of war veterans had even more favorable terms under the GI loan program run by the Veterans Administration, or the VA. In some cases, families need only come up with about 2% of the total cost of the home that they want to purchase. You put down that 2% and then you're able to move in and pick up with your monthly mortgage payments. So another industry that will be also powering America's economy during this period will be the home building industry. Suburban communities begin sprouting up in areas across the country, and you have companies like Levitt and Sons that will design and build entire communities. So Levittown, which will spring up on Long Island in New York State, will be kind of a classic example of one of these post-war suburban planned housing settlements. Levitt's homes were prefabricated, meaning they were partially assembled in an off-site factory rather than everything being built on-site. What this meant is this lowered labor costs, making the final product much more affordable to American families. So, for instance, a home at Levittown could cost your average family only between $8,000 to $9,000 during the late 1940s and early 1950s. And they could produce these homes very, very quickly. In a 3-year period between 1947 and 1950, more than 10,000 homes were constructed in this one community alone. And we see a similar trend taking place nationwide. In fact, by 1960, 1/4 of all homes in the United States had been constructed in the previous decade alone. There is a major housing boom across the United States during the 1950s. And you have to understand there's an enormous draw to home ownership during this period. Let's think about all the chaos of recent decades. First, the Great Depression and the many troubles associated with that, and then a global war and many young men not returning home or returning home seriously scarred, either physically and or emotionally, from the pain and suffering that they had witnessed. So after the war, people are in nesting mode. That's the way I like to say it. People want everything to settle down. They want to have a nice, safe, little cozy place to call their own and to achieve the American dream. This is the period where we really see home ownership being tied to the notion of achieving the American dream. You're a real adult. You're a real successful American if you can return home to your nice little house with your white picket fence, your 2.5 kids, and your little dog, so that everything there's a strong emotional lure towards home ownership during this period. And for American producers in industry, this is a wonderful period for them as well. When you buy a home, you also need to buy stuff to put inside the home. So Americans are flocking to items like washing machines, tools, ladders, lawn mowers, and there's really no bigger consumer item in terms of popularity that Americans are snapping up than the television. This is a nearly brand new technology that by the 1950s, the production price has fallen to the point where now it's not a luxury just for the wealthy, that your average middle-class family can afford this type of new technology. To give you an idea of how quickly this technology will penetrate American households, in 1946, there were only 17,000 sets in the nation. By 1949, however, just 3 years later, there were 250,000 TV sets being sold every month in the country. Popular shows for children included Howdy Doody Time and the Mickey Mouse Club. Older viewers preferred situation comedies like Father Knows Best or I Love Lucy. Americans of all ages became exposed to increasingly sophisticated advertisements, too, on this new technology. While you were being entertained, in other words, you were also being exposed to TV commercials. And these commercials were encouraging you to buy yet more products. And we'll also see during the 1950s, as the United States and the Soviet Union continue to be locked in the so-called Cold War, we'll see a lot of new products that will be the result of innovation in, of all things, aerospace design. We're getting into the era of the so-called space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Who can launch a human-made object and then ultimately a human into orbit around the Earth? So it's interesting that we see, in terms of industrial design, you see cars, you see a number of appliances that end up having a lot of this sort of shiny chrome buttons on them, stainless steel, things that look reminiscent of items that you might find in a future spacecraft. You also see new chemicals, in particular the plastics industry, rolling out a number of consumer items, such as Tupperware, during this period. So it looks like everything is on the up and up for Americans during the 1950s. However, we do need to look at some of the negative effects of this process known as suburbanization. We'll start with something that most of us kind of take for granted on a daily basis, that is the congestion on our roads. Traffic will start to increase exponentially, as now every household has its own automobile. All those idling cars are belching out particulate matter into the atmosphere. They're dripping oil onto the interstate or on the local roads, which will be washed into our rivers and streams. Not only that, but entire forest will be felled to create some of these new planned suburban communities. So it represents a loss of habitat for many native plants and animals. Further, you can see, as people are now having yards to maintain, that these new mowers that are being put out, the ones that have an internal combustion engine, they're also belching out, particulate matter into the atmosphere. Homeowners who are anxious to have a better looking yard than their neighbor are dumping countless chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers on their yards. Those chemicals don't magically disappear. Instead, when it rains, those chemicals run off into sewers, and those sewers run off into, you guessed it, our water sources for drinking water. There are some other negative effects of suburbanization. Some of them related to a perceived loss of individuality in the United States. One way in which housing contractors were able to produce these homes in suburban areas so cheaply was by basically using a common template and then just replicating it. So you have all these sort of cookie cutter homes that are designed exactly the same. They're laid out on exactly the same measurements for each lot. Here on the slide, I have a photograph of an aerial view of Levittown. And this graphically illustrates the point that some people were critical of when it came to these suburban housing developments, that everything looked the same. Every house was sort of designed the same way. They're on similar size lots. That it was increasingly hard to be an individual in a country where you look and sound and even live in places that are identical to everyone else. So there were critics of social conformity that were speaking out as early as the 1950s. Social philosopher Lewis Mumford, for instance, noted that suburban housing constituted, in his words, quote, a multitude of uniform, unidentifiable houses, lined up inflexibly at uniform distances, on uniform roads, in a treeless communal wasteland, inhabited by people of the same class, the same income, the same age group. Even worse, we see that many of these new housing communities will forcibly keep out non-white residents. For instance, applicants who wish to purchase a home in Levittown had to sign a contract that read, quote, no dwelling shall be used or occupied by members of other than the Caucasian race. So suburbanization reinforces residential segregation in the United States. We'll also see that with a lack of tax revenue in these urban areas that are being abandoned, that we'll see the decay of inner cities. Now there's not enough police, crime rates spike in many areas, school performance goes down because there's no way to hire good teachers with lack of money. More on this in the second half of this lecture.